For those of you currently interested in my content, this is going to be a really long video with editing that is not very interesting. It's just going to be me talking, occasionally getting very angry, and a lot of statistics and charts. However, it is the groundwork for something hopefully really special. And if you stick around in this channel, you're hopefully going to see what I'm talking about. But if somehow you're not on the edge of your seat captivated by the politics and economics of a place you're not from and can't vote in, for whatever reason, I would highly encourage you to take a look at the other projects that I'm currently working on. I am live on Twitch at twitch.tv/relatively civil discourse live, where I play games and chat about politics, and I post pretty much everything I stream there on a YouTube channel unsurprisingly named Relatively Civil Discourse Live. I also have a personal YouTube channel named Kim McCartney, where I will be posting video essays about any non-political topics that interest me. First up is probably going to be a 5-ish part series trying to discover who the greatest general in human history is. I would really appreciate it if you checked out any of these other projects. Thank you. Alright then, welcome to the first series on this channel. If you haven't watched the introduction of the channel, I highly recommend you do. It's going to explain who I am and why I'm doing this. But what I'm here to do in this video is introduce part 1 of a 6-ish part series putting together a portfolio of policy resolutions designed to address the issues that matter to Albertans the most. At the end of this series, we will hopefully have what could be called a platform that, hypothetically, if shown to enough people, could be presented to our elected representatives in order to help us get out of the giant political mess we are currently ensconced in as a province. However, it needs to be kept in mind that the one writing this platform is me. I'm just one guy with no complete form of post-secondary education who sees the province going through a bad time who wants to try and help. I am not an economist. I am not elected. I am doing my best to try and identify problems accurately and to propose feasible solutions to those problems that we can all agree on. I might get it wrong in this series. I might put my foot in my mouth. In fact, I'm going to. I would just like to say in that regard, I am just starting this. I do not know how it is done. In fact, what I am doing is not really done that often. So, on this series, specifically, more than the rest of my work, I would just like to ask you to be patient with me and try and understand that I'm just a 22-year-old guy trying to hammer out the necessary political compromises of the 21st century to show that it can be done. Speaking of compromises, by the way, I really want to hear what you have to say about this platform. So please, tell me if you see something inaccurate that you disagree with, or even if you just have a good idea or an alternative proposal. Please, by all means, let me know. Nothing about this project would make me happier or more proud than for this to be a collective document written by the people of this province together. I would also like to say that, by the end, this document is more than likely not going to be an effective representation of my ideology as a whole. As I've stated previously, I'm a libertarian. I think that the exact extent of the government's power should be limited to only those things that provide public goods to everyone, while maintaining individual rights and using the judiciary to negotiate the administration of those rights. In the unlikely event I am ever elected, it will probably be to negotiate the modern welfare state into a government that fulfills that prescription. However, what I want to do before I even attempt to start an audacious agenda is convince the overwhelming majority of citizens that it's the right way to go. That is a very tall order. It is in the least a political career's worth of work, and we're not going to be getting there in my first 10 or my first 1,000 videos. What I want to do with this platform is adapt the Albertan government in its current form to one that better suits the interests of its people, irrespective of my ideological predilections, but the size and scope of government. In short, this is designed to be a realist document that I ideally want at least 60% of Albertans to be in favor of. This means that I'm going to be making lots of personal compromises. This platform will not be an effective representation of what I think about politics, but will rather be a list of policies that I think we could use to get the province back on track. That being said, despite the compromises, I fully intend to write a platform that I would run on if the time ever came. Now, the current outline of the platform looks like this. Today's video is about determining whether or not the Alberta oil industry has a future. I would also like to write 2 more videos pertaining specifically to the Alberta economy itself. One more directly tied to the regulatory minutiae of the oil industry, and one that is completely focused on the government's role in managing Alberta's other major industries. However, because they are tedious, take a long time to write, and frankly are a little bit boring, we will be moving on in the next part to discuss how everything I'm about to state about the Alberta oil industry interacts with the demands of a 21st century environmental policy, and see if it can create some synthesis out of these often extremely oppositional policy goals. Much more fun! After that, it is pretty much open season in terms of topic choice. I am planning on collecting topics based on this CBC poll on the issues most important to Albertans in the 2019 provincial election, and also to just borrow from topics covered by both major parties in the 2019 platforms. But of course, feel free to chime in if you have a topic suggestion. Anyway, currently the plan is to just do that repeatedly until I have something I consider comprehensive enough to stop. With those plans, and the plans for the rest of the platform out of the way, we can finally get into part one of our series and determining whether or not the Alberta oil industry has a future. Now, the rest of this video is going to be presented in two parts. Firstly, I'm going to inform you of everything that I think the average Albertan should know about the most discussed sector of our economy, hopefully providing you with a clearer picture of the Alberta economy than what oil executives, politicians, and the media have presented us with so far. After informing you of the situation in part two of this video, I would like to present you with what I think looks like a better path forward for Alberta's oil industry than what the NDP or UCP have presented to us thus far. Also, sorry to interrupt, but it's getting a little dark in here. Let's try and lighten things up a little bit. Is that better? Does this make me like horrifically orange, or am I like warmly lit now? So the first thing I think you should know about the Alberta industry is how dependent we are on it. Now, if you would ask me before I began writing this video, I probably would have guessed 25, 30, maybe even 40%. Well, here you go. These are the numbers. As of 2019, oil and gas make up the largest share by far, but we are much more diversified than I initially expected, so that is just fantastic news. What this graph doesn't tell you, and what is very hard to calculate from an economic perspective in my opinion, is how many sectors of our economy are dependent on downstream growth from the oil industry for their businesses' growth and expansion. But anyways, now the next thing I think you should know is how much oil we actually have, which is something that I didn't know before I started this video. Turns out, we have a lot of oil. Like, a lot of oil. Like, way more than I thought we had. Alberta has the fourth largest oil reserves on the planet. Not Canada, mind you. Alberta. Alberta has more oil in it than all of Russia. Just so you know, because I did not, 160 billion barrels of oil to their paltry, pitiful, pathetic 80 billion barrels. And while we're talking about other countries, you should also know that Canada is the fourth largest oil producer in the world and accounts for 6% of global production. Now, because humans really need it, there are a lot of ways to get oil out of the ground. And in Alberta, we mostly do it two ways. About 1/3 of our oil is pumped out of the ground, nice and easy. And about 2/3 of our oil comes from bitumen extraction, which are the oil sands that you and me have both heard so much about over the years. Now that you know how much oil we have and how we get it, you should probably know who owns it. First of all, we own it. The natural resources of this province and of this country belong to every citizen collectively, in common. Firstly, not secondly, to the corporations we permit to extract them on our behalves. But aside from that, actually getting to the corporations we permit to extract those resources. According to a report by the Edmonton-based Parkland Institute, the 5 largest oil companies in Alberta control about 80% of the extraction. And according to the Narwhal, of all places, they raked in approximately $53 billion in revenue in the fiscal year 2016-2017, of which approximately $10 billion were collected in profits, $2 billion were collected in royalties. You should also know that 74% of Alberta's unrefined oil goes to the United States, 11% of it goes to the provinces, 15% of it gets refined right here in province, and less than 1% of it touches any other market. So bam! For some reason, after 22 years of residence, 5 elections which I remember, one of which I voted in, that is the information that I was somehow never told by the media, public education system, or our politicians. Or at least that is the information I never retained, just in case it's my bad there. So now that we've covered Alberta's participation in the American oil market, let's briefly move on to take a look at some other ones, because this is something that has always confused me about Albertan politics. It is a very common political talking point here that X legislation, Y candidate, or Z position is going to discourage economic investment in Canada, and that these investors, whoever they are and wherever they're from, can go other places. And, well, I have a question for these people. Have you ever really looked at our competition? A lot of these countries might not be around in 50 years, let alone the companies that are based in them. Now, let us take a gander at some of the other countries around the world that I consider to be our top competition. Now, some countries, they have it easy. Countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran have large supplies of liquid crude oil that, if introduced to the natural forces of pressure and then aided artificially once this pressure reaches equilibrium, will literally shoot out of the ground, into barrels, and then straight into your wallet. Now, as I said earlier, oil pumps actually account for about 1/3 of our oil extraction. However, this pumped oil has already largely been discovered and accounts for a small and continually dwindling fraction of total oil confirmed discovered in Alberta, over 80% of which lies in the oil sands. This is important for 2 reasons. Firstly, for reasons I won't get into because they are quite boring and very complicated, it makes oil extracted from the oil sands far less profitable to extract and therefore far more dependent on higher oil prices. And because of the particularly carbon-intensive method of extraction used in Alberta, Alberta extracts literally the dirtiest oil in the entire world. Well, not if you account for the blood-stained oil the world buys from everybody else but us, but environmentalists, liberals, and leftists like to ignore that very important fact, which we'll be getting into quite briefly. Moving on to our tour. First and foremost, let us get it out of the way. The United States is our best competition on the globe. They are the largest consumer and producer of oil on Earth. However, I really don't think it needs to be said that the United States is not our competition. They are our customer. North American oil demand is so ravenous that it doesn't actually matter how much oil the United States outproduces us at and at a lower price, because they just need our energy that bad and they'll always be willing to pay our slightly higher price. Moving on to the second country on our tour, Norway. Norway is a great country that I happen to be a huge fan of. I'm half Norwegian, by the way, and I am very disappointed to tell you, people of Alberta, that this is the only country on Earth that I think people would be better off buying oil from than us. They're super close to Europe's largest energy consumers. They have large supplies of easily accessible liquid crude oil that has a dramatically lower carbon footprint than Albertan oil. They're also the only oil producing country on Earth that is more ethical than Canada, in my humble opinion. So they have that going for them. Just one problem, though, and I have to admit this is a puzzler for me. It kind of seems to me like the world hasn't realized what I just said yet, or that there is some large barrier of investment here that I'm yet to detect. Because despite Norway being the 13th largest oil producer in the world, and despite the fact that Europe is going through an energy crisis right now due to the Russo-Ukrainian war, nobody is talking about Norway or Norwegian trade as a solution to this problem. There are no plans that I'm aware of to expand North Sea pipeline projects, despite the fact that Nord Stream 2 just got canceled. But that is enough about Norway. Like I just said, they're the only people on Earth that I think could be considered a better choice than us. Let us talk about all the people that aren't. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the definition of a dictatorship with good regime stability. Despite being extremely well armed, the Saudi military is poorly trained and poorly commanded. However, other than that, things look pretty peachy. The House of Saud has been continuously ruling the Arabian Peninsula since 1930. The royal family remains deeply entrenched in all levels and mechanisms of government, and the transition from the current king to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is set to be seamless. While the Arabian people are more politically vocal than ever, few, if any, viable alternative paths remain available to them. They're also far too concerned with foreign threats to look inwards at the moment, in my opinion. Saudi Arabia is the second largest oil producer in the world, and I would definitely say that they're our best competition on the globe next to the US and Norway. They're also the de facto head of OPEC, and they own the world's most valuable oil company, and the world's second most valuable company, Aramco. Also the most polluting company in the world, by the way. However, there are 4 reasons why I think Saudi Arabia is not worth your time or money when it comes to investment. Number 1, they're not economically diversified enough to deal with the incoming contraction of the oil market, unlike Canada. Number 2, Saudi Arabia is placed in an extremely conflict-prone global region that is routinely victim to domestic and foreign invasion. It is locked in a cold war with Iran, who it considers to be its mortal enemy. Saudi Arabia has and will be attacked with dozens, if not hundreds, of missiles, drones, and aircraft over the next 50 years, and have their oil production hampered or halted as a result. This alone seems like a huge barrier of investment to me that is currently not priced into the Saudi oil market. Number 3, the Saudi Arabian people overwhelmingly oppose their current Western ties, and vociferously oppose increasing those ties. The people who actually live there do not, and never have actually wanted to do business with us. It is only because they are politically repressed and economically exploited that they have tolerated this for so long. However, at some point this century, the chickens will come home to roost. I assure you. Number 4, Saudi Arabia is ruled by an evil, cruel, tyrannical, absolute monarch. Saudi Arabia has been committing what the UN has labeled as genocide in Yemen for years now. Brought to you by us, by the way. Huge props to the Harper and Trudeau governments for selling weapons to these assholes. These seem like large barriers of investment to me. It honestly kind of seems strange to me that people buy oil from or continue to invest in these people at all. Anybody that buys Saudi Arabian oil should truly reconsider switching to almost any other source, let alone Albertan. At least then your oil wouldn't be bloodstained. At least then your money wouldn't go to abetting a genocide. Your money wouldn't go to a country with a Freedom House score of 7. You wouldn't be funding one of the world's 5 remaining absolute monarchies. So if you or your country claims to care about human lives and human rights, divest from Saudi Arabia. Looking at you, Japan, South Korea, India, who purchase a combined $50 billion with a B dollars annually from the Saudis. Please consider us. 15 minutes could save you 15 lives on human rights violations. Also, Quebec, Ontario, what are you doing buying oil from these guys? At least the countries that I just mentioned are 20,000 kilometers away from us. What is your excuse? Next on our list, we have Russia. Now, Russia, in my opinion, is definitely our 3rd best competition on the globe. However, not a good place to invest in or keep your money. For starters, and I completely intend to talk about this later and in other videos, I consider Russia to be the premier international relations wildcard of the 21st century. They could become a superpower again. They could expand. They could contract. They could collapse. In the past 2 centuries, almost no ruler of Russia has been in charge longer than 25 years. Stalin ruled from 1924 until 1953. Khrushchev ruled until 1964. Brezhnev ruled until 1980. Gorbachev, the last 9. And the Tsar made it 23 years. Putin's term expires in 2024, and he took over from Yeltsin in 2000. There is currently no viable successor lined up. The oligarchical house of cards that Putin relies on is becoming increasingly precarious. The people's approval of him, which has in my opinion always been predicated on restoring Russian international prestige and creating economic prosperity, is failing. Well, because even before the Russo-Ukrainian War, Russia had never been more internationally unpopular, and COVID-19 had pretty much left the Russian people with the same amount of wealth they had 10 years ago, with an economic growth rate that is practically the lowest in 20 years. Once again, before the Russo-Ukrainian War. I call them a wild card, however, because nobody really knows what form of government they're going to land on next, if they switch at all, and they're the only other country in the world that stands to benefit more from climate change than we do. It all depends, however, on their ability to take advantage of it. And that is a topic for another video. But if the Russian state literally not being around in 10 to 30 years is not enough to dissuade you from investing, please allow me to remind you that Russia is currently the election interference capital of the world, the international cyber attack capital of the world's leader in high-profile assassinations, and just to top it all off, the world's leader in 21st century annexation. Russia is one of the worst places to do business in the world, just managing to edge out of the bottom 50 worst countries to do business on the planet, according to this German think tank. Now, originally, our tour included all the other top 10 oil producers: Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Brazil. But let's be honest here, Iran and Iraq practically cover themselves. Kuwait is not really the major player it was in the oil game when it was invaded just over 30 years ago. And Brazil, well, to my discredit and slight embarrassment, I did not even know Brazil had any oil until I looked at the list of top 10 producers. So all 4 of these countries are clearly demonstrably worse places to invest in or keep your cash, and I don't even think we need to get into it. Thank you for joining me on our brief little tour. I hope that my point has been made here. Well, yes, Alberta governments have done a lot of things to make it more difficult for investment to translate into profits in the past 20 years. There is no chance that our government is going to collapse in the next 10 years. Well, let me rephrase. Small chance. With those premises taken into account and this information supplied, we can move forward into some conclusions. However, it should be said before we do that I clearly could be missing a premise in these political calculations. I am not a petroleum economist. I don't know how pipelines work. I'm not an environmental economist either. I don't have an accurate estimation of the opportunity cost of the policies I am about to advocate for. My point here is, before we move on, if you think that I have missed any relevant information that you think we should know, please feel free to fill me in. Alrighty, part 2. So, the question everybody wants to know, and one of, if not the major questions I think we should all be voting on in 2023, is simply this: does the Albertan oil industry have a future? Now, to answer that question, you have to take one critical fact that I have neglected so far into account, and one fact that presently the NDP, UCP, along with oil executives and media, have completely chosen to ignore, in my opinion, and that fact is that the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of the United States have both pledged to make their countries carbon neutral by 2050. And if you're not doing the math here, that accounts for, 99.9% of the current Albertan oil market. Now, I know that this news has environmentalists who think that people like me want to destroy the planet salivating at the mouth. And I know that this has oil lobbyists ready to start decades of legal challenges. And if you're anything like me, this news has you very worried about the future of what is currently our province's most important industry. Well, please allow me to assuage your concerns. Number one, both the President and the Prime Minister, especially the Prime Minister, have no idea how to achieve this goal at all, let alone on that timeline. So, until the rubber starts meeting the road here and affecting your margins, I would not sweat it so hard. However, at this point, it is definitely a question of when, not if. Secondly, carbon neutral does not mean carbon zero. There is a world of difference between those two things, because people who live in reality, such as myself, are aware that even if we don't use hydrocarbon extraction for energy or transportation anymore, we are still going to need the millions of oil-based products that we require to live. Jets are not going to stop flying. We're not going to stop using plastic anytime before the turn of the century. There is still plenty of money to be made and decades to slowly transition this sector of our economy into something more profitable and less polluting. Alrighty, hi there, ladies and gentlemen. You have no doubt noticed that math is currently on the left side of your screen. Well, I hate to break it to you, but I actually tried to do some math for this video, and I failed horrifically, as you might be able to tell by the presence of a freaking sigma sign required to determine the answer to this question. But what we are currently looking at is the total gross oil revenue that will come to this province between now and 2050 at various oil prices, presuming a 3% annual decline in export. Which, if you look at the revenue amounts on the lower half of your screen, is definitely the position we should be opening any future negotiations with, because I'm not sure if you're aware, but $1.2 trillion is quite the magic number in Canadian political circles in 2022. That number, $1.2 trillion, just for you listeners out there once again, happens to be what our total national debt will probably end up around by the end of this year, which means, yes, ladies and gentlemen, you are reading that right. If we nationalize all Alberta oil production, which we can't do, this would not be very profitable, we could literally pay off this entire nation's debt with zero taxes to the people from that revenue. So the good news is that there's still lots and lots of money to be made using our conventional business model. The bad news is that it's going to be obsolete in 28 years. Well, these companies will still make lots of money over this period, and the government will still collect billions in royalties. We are very quickly approaching the point of diminishing returns if we haven't already crossed it. What this means is that if we want to increase profits or royalties at all, or at least make them go down slower, which really might be the best we could do at this point, we need to connect Alberta oil to new markets. Now, this is something that confuses me deeply about the Alberta oil industry, to be honest with you. If you took a look at that graph from earlier, you would see that 99.9% of Alberta oil stays in this hemisphere. Now, if you would ask me before I started this video what percent of it goes anywhere else, I would have guessed 5, 10, maybe 15%. 99.9 is a suspiciously high number, and I think that there has to be a reason for this, but in all my research for this video, I really could not find an explanation. So this is something that I'm just going to have to ask you guys about. However, the things that I just mentioned are looming realities, not conjecture. So despite not knowing why we're not selling our oil to other countries, let's presume that we can, because I've done some research on that, and it really looks to me like we should. The second and third largest consumers of oil on the planet are China and India, respectively. Now, to put it mildly, China has not really liked Canada so much recently. The Chinese also import excellent natural gas and oil from Russia. They are not interested in doing business with us, and we will struggle to compete with Russian delivery methods and prices. India, on the other hand, is geographically isolated. It is flanked by countries that hate it. Pakistan will never stand for a pipeline through its territory that benefits India. It would be a modern-day engineering miracle to construct a large pipeline over the Himalayan mountains, and China isn't going to help them get oil either. That leaves only an ocean supply route, and I think it's one that we should be targeting. 83% of India's oil is imported from foreign countries, and 72% of India's electricity supply comes from coal, which means that we can make tens of billions of dollars funding their transition away from blood-stained oil, and we can reduce global emissions at the same time by providing an Indian transition away from coal. 2 for the price of none. Sounds like a complete win to me. I should also say that I would much rather India nuclearize its energy supply, considering they're already a nuclear power and the second most populous country on Earth. However, it looks to me like that is not the path they're choosing to take, and if they're considering non-nuclear paths, then we should want them considering ours. I am very confident that Canada should seek to sell oil to India. They are a very stable country, they're a former Commonwealth nation, they will be essential in the coming conflict against China. This second choice, however, I am less confident of. I'd like to do more research on this one and come back to you, but while we're here, let's talk about it. The second market that I think Canada should be targeting is Africa. Now, there is no place on Earth more ethnically diverse than Africa, and unfortunately, there is also no place on Earth more arbitrarily divided. Given this entire continent's propensity for conflict, it makes the construction of advanced infrastructure there, such as international pipelines, prohibitively difficult and expensive. Not to mention that any pipeline that gets built is pretty much permanently at risk of destruction, which will come at a huge cost to the state and the surrounding environment. Furthermore, Africa is the poorest continent on Earth. It lacks the capital and technology sector to support the broad-scale adoption of green and renewable technology. However, there is a region in Africa that I think we're going to be discussing a lot more in the 21st century. This region is known as the Sahel region, and it is comprised of Senegal, Mauritania, Mali, Algeria, Nigeria, Chad, Sudan, and Eritrea, among a few others. If we take a look at a climate map of 3 degrees Celsius warming, this region, unlike pretty much all of Africa, is going to become more, not less, temperate. So, large-scale migration to this region is likely in the next 80 years, even if climate change doesn't reach 3 degrees, which it most likely will not. Now, most of the countries in the Sahel are considered internationally relevant today, despite the pretty high probability, in my opinion anyway, that this region could become the potential home to over 100 million people by the end of the century. Those people are going to need a lot more energy, and we could be the ones to provide it to them. While solar panels, substations, and pipelines are not in abundance in the Sahel, you know what is? Railroads. Most of these countries have colonially constructed, export-based rail infrastructure. This is, in my opinion, a system that likely could be connected by 21st century investment, allowing for increased African free trade, and there should be some room for Albertan oil on those tracks. So now that we've identified potential buyers, we come down to the big problem. How do we get it there? This is a very prickly issue in Canadian politics, to say the least, but I have come prepared with a proposal. Or at least I'm preparing a proposal. One that I hope will eventually transform into a more concrete plan that I can share with you later that hopefully we can get Canadians behind. So, pipelines. Yes, pipelines. I'm sorry for saying the forbidden word, but we do actually need pipelines to export oil in large quantities and at competitive prices. There are more than a few pipelines that have been proposed, accepted, and rejected over the years, and I have some good news to all the environmentalists out there watching, because I only want to build 2 more pipelines for the rest of the century, and one of them is already under construction. So I would really appreciate it if you could just work with me on this one, okay? To get our oil to the Asian market, we're going to need to get it to the coast. Alberta oil gets there 2 ways. It goes south or it goes west through BC. Thankfully, as I just implied, this front has already been covered by the Notley and Trudeau governments, surprisingly, who will have the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion completed hopefully sometime in the next 2 years. Now, getting oil going the other direction has proven to be extremely difficult. This is because to get oil from the Alberta to the Atlantic Ocean, you're going to need to cross 180 separate indigenous communities, 5 provinces, 2 of which can never agree on anything, and 1 of which vociferously opposes said pipeline. This pipeline, before it was cancelled, was called Energy East. And while I have your attention, I would like to briefly, strongly encourage my Eastern Canadian brethren to reconsider this pipeline. Getting this pipeline into the Atlantic Ocean would allow us to fulfill our oil demands domestically for the indefinite future. We're talking end of the century here. No more blood-stained oil for the Canadian East. And as previously mentioned, it would allow us to connect Canadian oil to one of the areas it can be best used to combat climate change. Africa, specifically the Sahel region, which, like India, remains highly dependent on coal power. Second of all, it would lower the price of energy, which accounted for over 43% of Canadian inflation in 2021. That is right, by the way. That is a real number. Let it freaking terrify you. It is 2022, and the world has barely started to decarbonize the global economy. With these net zero pledges and carbon border taxes like the EU just passed, these absolutely teeny tiny drops in the bucket of what policymakers say we need to do to avoid catastrophic climate change, and energy prices account for over 40% of record high inflation in 2021. We've got to do something about that. However, on top of mitigating the rise of inflation, the Energy East pipeline would create thousands of jobs. If we design this project right, it has the potential to economically enrich hundreds of indigenous communities. We also could maybe use some of the workers from this project to refurbish other oil infrastructure that Canadian Easterners are concerned about, like Line 3. And it would also give Eastern provinces a larger share of Western oil profits. So, come on. Think about it, please. Okay, so we have a problem here. We are well over 5,000 words and well over 20 minutes into this video about regulating the Alberta oil sector, and we have not talked at all about regulating the Alberta oil sector. And you don't know this, but I actually started writing this platform in the summer of 2021, in like May, and it took me that long to get this far. Now, in that period, I wasn't only writing this video, I'm a part-time university student, and I also started about 15 scripts completely unrelated to this platform and wrote over 20,000 words for those other projects. All, of course, before uploading a single video. So, we're just going to have to call it quits there for today. As I said, we're going to be returning to the Alberta economy 1, 2, maybe even 3 more times before we're done with this platform. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, it is late, but we are done. Thank you so much for joining me on what has proven to be quite lengthy 30-minute adventure. I promise things are only going to pick up from here in terms of quality. Thank you so much for watching. I'm excited to see you in part 2. Please check out my other projects, and please subscribe to Relatively Civil Discourse. Goodbye!